Well, welcome to this segment of the Twitter Jobs. I'm Heston Nanura, where we discuss topical issues. Well, this morning we have a very pertinent topic, which is Pan-Africanism and the search for African unity, or Pan-Africanism and African unity. Well, just a little bit on what Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism conceptually is the strong attachment Black Africans have towards their continent, that is Africa, towards the African culture, and also towards African independence. Well, today, the idea of the Pan-African concept in one or the other was started in the late 1900s with conferences like in 1919 and 1900 in London and Paris, respectively, and it was spearheaded by very notable figures among who are George Padmore, Sylvester Henry, and also W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey. Later on, fast forward to 1945, the very remarkable conference in Manchester, which, 1945 was at the tail end of the Second World War. Pan-Africanists, came up and congregated in Manchester and tried to forge a way, because at that time they were fighting for decolonization. Fast forward again, we see that Pan-Africanism comes in the 1960s and also led to the formation of the Organization of African Unity, with notable figures like Julius Nyerere and also Kwame Nkrumah, the Amilcar Cabral of that time, and also produced very prominent Pan-African statesmen in the names of Thomas Sankara as well. And also, this has been all through, and up to now it is still standing. And this very morning, we are going to discuss how Pan-Africanism is very pivotal in fostering African unity, economic dependence, and also some bit of returning dignity to the African continent that has, you would agree with me, that has been historically, put in a place of servitude and has not gotten a chance to assert itself, in world affairs. It has always been at the receiving ends of metropoles, and it is still trying to play catch up. Well, to discuss this very important topic, I'm having Comrade Chairman Dr. Daniel Rugarama, Chairman of the Pan-African Movement, whom I am very glad to sit with after a very long time when we've not been on TV together. Good morning, Mzee Rugarama.
That is very true, but I'm very sure that whenever I'm not with you physically, we are always together spiritually, at least from the Christian angle.
Yes.
Good morning to you, our viewers, wherever you may be watching us from. And good morning once again, Comrade Munaro. You are doing a very good job.
Yes.
I want to believe that the population out there is appreciating.
Yes.
And the management, but at the same time also to give you comfort that for us, your mentors, we are also praying for you. The future out there is very bright. Keep on.
Yes. Comrade, fast forward, just give us, as chairman of the Pan-African Movement, I might have given some tidbits of the history, but maybe you would be very better, to give our viewers Pan-Africanism and its origin.
The Pan-African concept is a very interesting concept in the sense that everybody has defined it in the way he or she would want to. We have got different schools of thought in as far as the Pan-African concept is concerned, and those certainly who are against the concept itself have put in resources to have ideological distortion of the very concept. The neo-colonialists and the neo-colonial project do not sleep, but devote their energies and resources to make sure that this very concept is not understood. It is projected in the eyes of the general public as obscure and nothing but clamoring for things that are a myth. Pan-Africanism, simply put, is the spiritual ideological, moral, cultural, a whole pack of all that consciousness of those who have got their origin and attachment, like you put it, to the mother African continent. Whether they are on the African continent or away from the African continent. It is the belief, it is the manifestation of the belief that those who ascribe and claim origin and attachment from the African continent have got all it takes within their DNA and abilities and power to do all that they want to do successfully without necessarily relying on any other force or any other human being to either ice whatever project is being undertaken, short of which there is a belief that the project will collapse, which appears to be the case when you do not wear the Pan-African lenses. That is now the Pan-Africanism for you. You asked about the bit of history about it. Gladly, you have ventured there very well. The genesis really has got its roots from the treatment that those who claim and have association with the African continent have always made against or from the other races. First of all, we suffered slave trade.
Sure.
Slavery. Now, because of the slavery, because of the slave trade, we have our people scattered all over the globe. And when you go to Jamaica, which is not necessarily on the African continent, when you go to Trinidad and Tobago, which is not on the African continent,
Haiti.
When you go to Haiti, Ecuador, all those places, Brazil, they have got Africans or people of African descent who are not on the African continent. And because of the segregation and discrimination, the people you were mentioning, like the Pandemos, the Marcus Garveys, the Williams, they engineered, forget about now, for now, forget about the Professor W. Du Bois, but concentrate on those ones who are not necessarily on the American continent. The drive was to have actually theirs was radical, to have the people of association, African association and descent, come back to mother continent. It was that bad. Now, when you come to W. Du Bois, people like Dr. Martin Luther King, people like Comrade Malcolm X, people like now Comrade is now aged, Minister Louis Farrakhan, people like Elijah Muhammad, then, because he's the father of all those I'm talking about. Theirs was as a consequence of the stiff, ugly discrimination and segregation that they were experiencing on the American soil. And it came in form of civil rights movement. And the struggle has actually not ended there, because and probably the few manifestations of tokenism, like bringing up Barack Obama as the president, picking up some of the black in color ladies to sit on the top bench of the judiciary in America, having the vice president who is claimed to be an African. is nothing but tokenism. The substance really is that we still have the society, the American society, which is white dominated, and there is in-depth and written discrimination against the black community. Now,
yes,
just to a little bit, because I know you are going to go there, tell you, there are a number of conferences, and you did well not to dwell on all of them. Even before we had the Accra, I think what speaks volumes is the 45 Manchester conference, Congress, if you like. Now, what makes it unique and telling is that we, for the very first time, we had the representation from the African continent in Osejefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, in the Mwalimu Kambarage Julius Nyerere, in Ezekiwe, the Nigerian, in our senior brother from Conakry, Guinea, Sokoture. So that composition, and majority of them actually were there either as majority actually was as students. I think even senior comrade Jomo Kenyatta was there, and some of them were not necessarily students. They were, I think, with due respect to him, he was an unemployed young man who was just living with his girlfriend, and but somehow the thought and the zeal to have the Africa at heart found him there. And then there was that invitation from the organizers, which gave a greater impression that actually here we are talking about the people, and the people we are talking about who are on the African continent are fully represented here, and that's what makes it unique. And maybe going forward, we are going to see from these very people that we have mentioned, who are representative, direct representative from the African continent, what happened on the African continent.
Yes, very interesting and brilliant exegesis of the Pan-African, history. But Doctor, recently in my book projects, and 2 books I was majoring on, in fact one you keep on quoting it every time we get to interact, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and John Perkins' The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Now, what is Walter Rodney explains and says, Africa, how from the word go we were given, and history dealt us an unfair blow by being the continent where there is a lot of brigandage of our resources, to the social configurations on the African continent distorted, and maybe began being rebuilt, I think, times when African peoples were rebuilding, fighting colonization. But by the time we get post-colonial, Africa was just playing catch-up. And then the economic hitmen now even conflagrated the whole situation more worse and put us in more slavery, in quotes, I would say, huge debts, and in the name of privatization, in the name of development. How does now Pan-Africanism as an ideology get us out of that unfair beat that history dealt with us as Africans?
Yes. Now, let me take you back, and I seek the indulgence of our viewers. The representatives we had in Manchester Pan-African Congress, the Dr. Kwame Nkrumah Osejefo, the Ezekiwe, the I think Tubman was there, no, Tubman was not there. Because that Maghreb region, we can even have a debate, but the Tunis, Niger, Algeria, Morocco, they were having very great Pan-African credentials, their people at that time, the leadership at that time, because they were mainly fighting the French colonialism. But of course, we can debate now as to whether they are actually Pan-African anymore. That's a different debate altogether. Now, going back to what you have asked, it is $1 million loaded question, in the sense that here is a situation where, right from the start, the participants in the Manchester Pan-African Congress, when they came back, their drive was to make sure that they physically liberate the African continent. And this they did. So much to the extent that by the time we went into the 1963 Organization of African Union, we had well over 32 countries that had gained self-determination. Of course, you will ask that how independent were these countries. That's a different matter altogether. The problem with us now is that for us, the modern scholars, Afro-modern scholars, is that we do not want to give credit where it is due, because the nature of education that we have been exposed to does not enable us with adequate thinking tools to critically analyze some of these things and therefore apportion, give credit where it is due. Nevertheless, the physical independence of African continent was gained as a consequence of the spirit of Pan-Africanism. And the chief priest at that time, and everybody will agree with me, was none other than but Osejefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Of course, he was not alone. We have already mentioned the people he was with, including our not so much talked about brother in Egypt, Abdul Gamar. And like you also mentioned Ezekwe in Nigeria, we mentioned our brother Sekou. So all those, the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, of course, forget that even they themselves, including the emperor, of course, in Ethiopia. You see, even them, by the way, the question of the liberation from the economic shackle, which appears actually to be your question, really, is that it was addressed. It was actually it was brought on the table for debate. When you look at the speech of Osejefo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, he ably talked about the emancipation of African continent from the shackles, economic shackles of the former colonialists. And by the way, at that time, of the colonialists, because he was still there. But you see, trust the white man. What he had done at that time was that even before the meeting in Addis Ababa, he had divided. He had divided the African man who had gained independence and created the two camps. The Casablanca camp, which included especially the chief priest, was Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who said and was running efforts that let's have the independence, the United States of Africa now. One currency, one army, one government. We should not leave this meeting without having it. But remember that they had also developed another camp called the Monrovia Group. The Monrovia Group, some of these, of course, camps I'm talking about, they are given their names as a consequence of where they are having their meetings from. The Casablanca, then you know what I'm talking about, Morocco. Then yes. The Monrovia, you go if you want Brazzaville down there. Those were the camps. And that camp had the likes of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. For them, they were like, yes, we want to unite, but we want to unite progressively. And this debate is still on. Recently, may his soul rest in eternal peace, senior comrade Gaddafi was talking about the same. Let's unite. We missed an opportunity in 1963 our economies are in shambles. We shall be able to gain a lot by coming and being together. He was not understood. Then we went into the regional economic blocs, and the sympathizers of the same were saying we can unite, but let us unite progressively using the economic blocs. Now, the creation of institutions like ECOWAS, like SADC, like East African Community, like COMESA, and later in March 2018, the creation of Africa Continental Free Trade Area, is to answer what Brother Nkwame Nkrumah at that time, and also to answer your question, that can we get out of the economic shackles whereby our countries were grouped and tagged to the economies of our former masters? You go to the so-called French West Africa, and you look at all those 14 countries, and look at their currency, and look at the so-called Central Reserve banks. We have nothing here to talk about Central Reserve banks, economically speaking. The moment you move throughout the African continent, you have got well over 43 currencies. The convertibility, the conversion, in order for you to do business on the African continent, the levels of intra-African trade are extremely very low, less than 15%. How can you develop as a continent when the trading percentage amongst your member states is less than 15%? It means, therefore, that you are actually on an even trading level with the former colonial master, and majority of these countries, I must tell you, are at a level whereby we are all net importers, almost of everything. But the worst case scenario is food. If you doubt what I'm telling you, in some of these things, even including, by the way, dependency, our independence in terms of research, innovation, and medicine, for instance, if there was anything that we still had to hide from the public eye, everything was brought forward when we had COVID-19. We could only look to China, America, Europe for a redemption. Yet, we have got to have, even our trial to have our own remedy, which was coming from Madagascar. The big pharmaceutical industries could not allow. So, the economic question, which was never left out during the formation of the Organization of African Union, which was later resurrected in the renaming of Organization of African Unity to AU,
African Union, yes.
Which, unfortunately, the same question has been consistently and structurally fought through the Bretton Woods institutions of IMF and World Bank. Consistently has been time and again, when you look at all these that we have been having, Lagos plan of action, when you look at these
declarations,
the declarations we have had, wherever Maputo,
Arusha,
you know, all these are geared towards emancipation of the African man from the economic shackles, to dismantle. Actually, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is designed to dismantle the economic colonial arrangement of the African economies that the white man left. Now, as to whether we are going to succeed in that direction, it is just a question of time, because we know countries in Europe which are even worse off than some of the countries in. So it's not that by DNA, you look at Greece now. Greece is just nothing. If, for instance, Europe didn't want to get, the European Union didn't want to get embarrassed, I think they would have chased them out long time ago. The loans they give her for now almost 10 years, she has not been able even to pay a single. She does not even possess the ability within her to manage the loans that she has been given. Every year that comes in, she's given more money. Now, that tells you, therefore, that bad governance, poor economic policies, economic meltdowns are not a reserve of the African continent, like we have been told, but it happens everywhere. Just when Obama was coming into the American presidency, America was in a recession. They actually borrowed money from China to the extent that if China now, she was to go stubborn and brought a quarter of her, China has a dollar. She's not a dollar country, but she has the dollar as a reserve. Now, if she brought a quarter, just a quarter of her dollar reserves onto the global market or economy, I can assure you that the dollar will be as worthless as at one time we saw in Zimbabwe. So, yes, I want to conclude on this. When we are debating the Pan-African issues, we become very passionate. Yeah. I'm trying to control myself. Now, the economic question, I want to conclude by saying, if you want to know the economic question and the design of the white man for Africa, you just have to interest yourself in the works of which we have already mentioned here, the works of our brother, the former CIA man, Parkinson, and when he's writing in his book, The Confessions of the Economic Hitman, you will appreciate that there is a grand design. So much that they are even going to pick the best students from Africa, take them to the best of so-called best of their universities, Harvard, Yale, Oxford, etc., train them to come back and manage your Central Reserve banks, the biggest of your commercial banks, even put them in Africa Development Bank where we contribute less than 15% as the African continent, to make sure that the policies that are passed, formulated and passed, the action plans undertaken are nothing but a replica of the wishes of the colonial master.
You see, Doctor, I'll vacillate and also oscillate between so many topics because this gets interesting. Why is it that right about now that on the African continent we have pockets of political instability, pockets of conflicts within? They could be both interstate, they could be just one state, facing. Let's look at Chad, Mali, that side of French West Africa. Come this side of Ethiopia, the Tigray conflict. Then just right next to our nose in DRC. Where is Pan-Africanism in this era, whereby African unity could be able to, because Pan-Africanism fosters, African, it's one of its main objectives to create strong and concrete African unity. We see what is also happening in Cameroon. As the chairman of Pan-African movement, doesn't this worry you that it is a detriment to your long-term needed achievement of strong African unity and consolidation of African states into greater and stronger political units?
It bothers me a lot, and it gets me thinking. When you look at my CV, there is a way I put that I'm a thinker. Now, thinking, unfortunately, people think is not a serious thing. Actually, it is common when you ask somebody, you see somebody lost in thought, and you say, "What are you thinking?" He says, "Nothing." The problem is that we have got quite a lot of our people who are actually not thinking, and that is dangerous. Now, I can tell you with very great accuracy that the white man has never left. You see, and that's where we make a mistake. We think that we gained as a continent, with the last being the dismantling of the apartheid regime and bringing in people's government in South Africa with Comrade Nelson Mandela, that we are done with the independence of the African continent. No. The white man left a structure, a military political structure that has never been dismantled. Like how Africa Continental Free Trade Area purposes to dismantle the economic colonial arrangement that the colonial man left in place, that makes us, puts us at a disadvantage as a continent to have our trade balances very negatively reflecting, like how the same Africa Continental Free Trade Area purposes that we increase on the intra-trade, do away with tariff and non-tariff barriers, make sure that we industrialize, increase on the innovation of the African man. It is in the same light that we look at the dismantling of the African colonial political structure that the white man left in place. Unfortunately, we were not able. In 1963, at the formation of Organization of African Union, there was, even slightly before, there was need, there was talk that we can do away with the boundaries, the artificial boundaries on the African continent that were created in 1884-85 Berlin Conference. But when a critical thinking was done, they said this may create other problems. Nobody knows. Probably if they had done the readjustment of the boundaries, the political, geographical boundaries, to dismantle what the white man had put in place, probably would not have the kind of problems that we have now. Because when you look at the coups that you are talking about, be it in West Africa, especially let's go to West Africa, by the way, and probably maybe to take you back. The coups immediately after the formation of African Union, just to look at the coups. The coups were everywhere. There were coups in Egypt at that time to get rid of Abdul Gamal. There were coups to get rid of Zekowe. There were coups to get rid of
Kwame Nkrumah.
Kwame Nkrumah himself. I wanted to mention him last. Kwame Nkrumah himself was removed. There were coups of the progressive, against the progressive Patrice Lumumba in DRC, see whom they repressed him with. And from that time, all the coups that happened, certainly which were engineered by CIA, as we know, and their cousins, whom they have always worked with, they have never stopped, were meant to wipe Africa, to get rid of the cream that had gained independence. The rate at which those Kwame Nkrumah's converts and faithfuls were moving, had they been left, because you look at what happened actually. When Osejefo was removed through a coup, all his writings were also dismantled. They made sure what we see now, some of the writings that we see now, it was by God's grace that after a number of years, then somehow we were able to get some of his powerful writings. But the intention was get rid of the man, replace him with a pseudo Pan-Africanist like they did in DRC, because you know that later when they brought Wazabanga, Koko, Wazabanga, Mobutu, Sese Seko, he was nothing but just a pseudo Pan-Africanist whose job was simply to rhetoric about Pan-Africanism, but he was nowhere near the quarter guard of Emery Patrice Lumumba in terms of the Pan-African credentials. And this is written everywhere. Thomas Sankara got rid of. Ahmad Ben Bera got rid of. Zekewe got rid of. This brother of ours in Conakry, Guinea, got rid of.
America Cabral.
The America Cabral. They, all of them, that crop, after they had wiped it out, the replacements were the direct opposite of the people they had gotten rid of. Now, as a consequence, therefore, look at it this way. You leave in place a political structure that is certainly not homegrown. It is structured for purposes of enhancing the person's interests, the person who created that same structure, who is a white man. You get the people like the Nkurumas to occupy it, and you realize that they are on a move to dismantle the same political structure. You get rid of them. You replace them with the people who have got a similar skin, but whose perception of things is, with due respect, you will forgive my language, absurd and idiotic. What do you expect? That you are going to avoid coups. The reoccurrence of coups in West Africa is but what was expected to happen in the absence of the re-engineering. You see, there is what we call regeneration of Africa.
But maybe you continue, but maybe you factor in, yes, at that time it looked like a rule, but there were some exceptions. For instance, Jomo Kenyatta wasn't, taken off. Julius Nyerere also survived, and yet these were also very, Pan-African pundits at that time.
There was, you see, when one bewitches a woman not to give birth, it does not, sometimes some of the witchcraft may not be 100%. So we are not going to pride in the survival, the limited survival rates, because look, the southern part, when you look at, for instance, how many times the intelligence system, CIA, made attempts on the life of Air Commandant Fidel Castro, countless number of times. You will say, but he survived. But yes, thank you so much. He survived at what cost? The cost that Cuba has had to pay as a consequence of not playing ball has been great. We thank them. We are with them. They know, like they have been with us. But I want to tell you that the impact of the colonial masters' onslaught on the African continent, when he wanted to get rid of all those great personalities that we are talking about, and having survival in the likes of Jomo Kenyatta, certainly you cannot put Jomo Kenyatta in the same category and bracket of people like Kwame Nkrumah, people like Ben Bera, people like Thomas Sankara, people like Patrice Lumumba. He was not in that category. He was, yes, you can credit his Pan-African credentials, but there is a level where an enemy looks at an opponent and the target, and he says, I think I can leave this one in the state in which he is. He is not as lethal as the other one. And the application of the methods to contain a situation also differ depending on the gravity of the situation. That situation also includes the person who is actually playing within. Some people on the African continent, with whatever percentage of the Pan-African credentials, have been ignored but not left alone. Somebody can ignore you but keeps you in watch. I want to tell you that the African Union, for instance, as we have it now, is an institution that has, in majority of the cases, is ignored. But it is never left alone. Who funds all the projects that we have? Not that we cannot develop our own, cannot have our own money, but the white man will not leave you alone. We must have another revolution like Gaddafi was proposing to have, and that is why they applied a new method of containing him. They could no longer leave him or ignore him because he was at a stage where he was going to cause a major shock to the balance of power.
So do we say that these pockets of conflicts in these other African states at the moment in time, if we do not do away, because they are, just as we sometime back discussed about how people say, most say that Pan-Africanism is leaned towards apportioning blame to colonialism and neocolonialism, but does not look at the at the internal problems. What one person told me is called Afropolitanism, that we are so much envisaged at apportioning blame to external, causes of our own problems, but we do not look at the internal innuendos as to why we are not yet where we want, especially looking at the 2063 agenda of the African Union.
I will tell you that the other big problem that we have on the African continent is a crop of intellectuals who are extremely dishonest. They are intellectually dishonest, and they have gained a lot of miseducation. And in their miseducation, they intellectualize their miseducation and want to popularize it to look the correct and official position, that when we give them the audience, like they have always gotten, we run a risk of having our people disoriented. I can tell the viewers that the worst form of ignorance is not primary ignorance. Inability to read and write in English may not be a problem, or French, or whatever you want to call it. Because look, we are called Anglophone, Francophone. Why? We have less than 25% of Ugandans speaking English. But because it is called the official language, so we are Anglophone. We have less than 25%, if you like, of people speaking French in Mali, in Guinea, in all these places, but they are called Francophone. So we have got a crop of intellectuals who unfortunately are on the increase, and they are shaping the African agenda. That worries me. If we must be worried, we must be worried about people who are coming up. Like St. Paul said, that I have taught you this gospel. Whoever comes and preaches a different gospel,
let him be cast.
Let him be cast. May those people who are preaching a gospel which is different from the Pan-African, true Pan-African gospel, be cast. Because they have a problem. And they are setting our continent so many miles backwards and playing in the hands of the imperialist. I want also to add that yes, there are certain things which we can do ourselves and we have not done it correctly on the African, no doubt about it. Absolutely true. But I want to tell you that Africa's blueprint, for instance, if we are to take the African Union now, in the wisdom and the words of my senior, Professor Piero Lumumba, he says that they have the correct agenda. They write the correct pieces of paper, but they do a different thing. Now that one is not by mistake. They do that because they have been captured. There is what we call capture. That capture, which comes from the imperialist, where he comes up and pays for the projects you are undertaking, sometimes initiates and brings to a fore and creates an impression that it is you who has actually manufactured the project. You have come up with the same project and you are the ones who is actually promoting it, when he is actually behind in the curtains and looking at what you are doing. Majority of the African countries actually, leave alone the African Union, are doing what they are doing, not because these are there, because I will tell you, just go a little bit back and see. By early 1980s, majority of Africa was progressively moving into export-led economy rather than import-substituted economy. What happened? Things like regionalization, things like the currency devaluation, things like export to import substitution came up. What did we have? That economies like Nigeria, economies like Ghana, economies like South Africa, even Uganda, which had advanced to a certain stage in manufacturing. You remember our textile industry here. We had moved to an extent that we are now manufacturing these things, consuming them, and at the same time we were exporting. That stopped. We became a net import continent, to the extent that even in food, whereby over 65% of our continent is arable, we are still a net food importer. And if you think I'm lying, COVID, again, didn't only expose us in terms of dependency on innovation and science in the world of medicine, it also exposed us greatly in the field of food, regrettably. Therefore, the Pan-African movement, our agenda is not to organize, agonize, as our slogan says. Ours is to systematically, painfully keep organizing. And we are doing this against a mountain of challenge, because the colonial masters project in imperialism is alive and well. And it manifests itself everywhere where the African man wants to overcome those challenges. When you go to regional economic blocks, you will find the imperialistic-minded fellas there. When you go to African Union body, you will find the imperial agenda there. Even when you look at, because you see, the agenda 2063 of the African Union that we are talking about is being realized in the formation of regional economic blocks, Now the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which in itself is a Magna Carta to the development and self-reliance of Africa as a continent because maybe we organize some day and we look at this Africa Continental Free Trade Area, because it is a mountain of a debate that I risk losing a lot of time if I verge into discussing.
Yes, let me shift the gears a little bit. Why is it that, okay, maybe apart from me who has at least had the benefit of being raised and a person like you, but generally the youth that I interact with, when you get into this topic of Pan-Africanism, you realize that the millennials of my age are not readily, or even in substance and form, understand what all is about. By the time you sit down to get into the intricacies of what it is, you find that most of the youths are either very fascinated by entertainment, and actually which is Western dominated, into Western movies. By the time you tell someone as young as I am to sit down and get into these critical ideological and topical issues about what Africans are and what we should be and what we should stand for, they seem to be so there is a big disconnect, and they look at you, a fellow young man living in a different, or what they would call a boring life. What would Pan-Africanism or the Pan-Africanist movement do, to get back such a critical demographic back into understanding the Pan-African ideological orientation? Is there anything the Pan-African movement is doing to this, to see that if we have this demographic, then we are good to go? If the Pan-African movement has this demographic in its hands, we are good to go.
Even what we are doing right now is part of the great program that we are rolling out. The truth of the matter, and to go by the words of my senior brother Osfon in Nigeria, which was also repeated by the late comrade Dr. Our former Secretary General, if at the end of my life, God knows when that will be, I want to believe not less than 150 years from now, my little daughter growing up and somebody else's son also growing up somewhere on the African continent and beyond will not be able to see the relevance of Pan-Africanism, then as a consequence of my inability to deliver that message, then I would have let down the Pan-African cause. The forces, like I said, we are against are stronger and financially oiled. We have got capitalism, which is a project of imperialism rearing its head everywhere. Things like communism are blanketed and described as bankrupt ideologies. But look, China is a communist state, if you like. Of course, you have those people who are not honest, tell you that China is not really a communist state. But when it suits them, they will say those are communists, they are repressing their own people, they have a command economy, and all those are tenets upon which communism is built. Now that's when they want to bash them. But when you say, okay, if they are all this that you are talking about, how come China is the fastest growing economy, it is projected that in the next, that was 2013, 2018, 2017, around there. It is projected that in the next 10 years, it will be the biggest economy. Now it is the second largest economy. It will be the largest economy on the globe. And that because now I think it has, by 2025, can cross-check that, they would have created over 500 million people who are, that will be, yes, millionaires, should be millionaires. Now, that is very serious because China is about 1.4 billion people. Now we're talking about 500 millionaires. 500, millionaires, billionaires, something like that. Billionaires, probably there. Now, this economy allows well over, which they say is repressive and is a communist state, allows well over 139 million people to get out of the country, do business, and then they come back. I would want to live in such a country. Because if repression means doing business, getting out of the country and coming back at will, and also living in an economy that is the second largest in size and is projected to be the first by 2025, then that is a very beautiful country. But I hasten also to add, we are in a phase, a technological phase, the fourth revolution, what they call the fourth revolution, where everything is moving very fast. Our slogan is very clear: organize rather than agonize. We have got to be part of the process. We must also direct events as Pan-Africanists. If it is the e-learning, if it is the technological advancement like we are experiencing now, we must take part in spreading the gospel, in having our team as part of the process to realign the thinking, be part of this fourth industrial revolution, such that we can shape the agenda going forward.
So you've answered, though I really wanted to look at how do we bring in the youth to understand this and break this bit where there is a lot, quite even youths that have gone to school, could be university, they seem disinterested. And that would be very bad if we don't have African, because you talk about the Kwame Nkrumahs. These were young people by then.
29, 20,
30,
yeah.
Almost at my age of, yes. So how do we get such a crop now back and interested? And then, because when I was bringing up this topic this morning, one of the producers gave us like, we look at that as for old professors, and and it's like that would be a a topic. So how do we how does the Pan-African movement now move into interest these young elite scholars that are coming up, even those that have not even gone to school, to appreciate how, to appreciate being the Africanness of who we are and what we intend to be, to assert ourselves or in global issues?
You see, when you go back to what Pan-Africanism is, you will appreciate that it is not rocket science to actually infuse and interest the people, whether in formal or informal sectors, to act, breathe, speak Pan-Africanism. Why? When you look at the projects almost all the projects, by the way, because you see, I must tell you, actually your question is very good and it has got a very direct answer. Now, I will tell you that all structures of African Union, including the projects that come from the African Union, have got the driving spirit of Pan-Africanism. How? When you look at the time of the chairperson, that aunt of ours, Dr. Dlamini Nkosazana Zuma, you remember the speech which she wrote. She wrote a speech to also read it to the heads of state just before she got out of the office. And she was, it is called an apology speech to Osejefo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, that you were right. Then when you said that we had to unite, we should have united. Because we would not be having fragmented states, we would not be having discrimination, we would not be having comfort in our small individual countries, and we would not be having this flag independence, which is not reflected in the economies that we are having. But she also goes ahead to say that all hope is not lost. At least we can look forward, and we have given ourselves this document, this agenda 2063, and we shall operationalize it through projects like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So you can see that when you look at the Agenda 2023, look at innovation and science, look at the digital age that we are talking about, look at the role of the youth. You go to the Continental Africa Free Trade Area, look at the youth. They are structured and they are given a very important role which they are going to play in the realization of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Look at women. So, look at science and innovation. Look at the intra-trade. You know, all that is now being operationalized at our secretariat in Accra, Ghana. And when you look at, there was also this issue, because you're grappling with the issue of agriculture, where we've got a niche. You cannot have over 65% of the African continent being arable, and we are talking about ourselves being a net food importer. It's impossible. It's criminal. We can't sustain that. But when you look at how, for instance, the former CEO of Africa Development Bank structured in the youth into accessing money from different commercial banks in their respective countries. As a result of the money these other countries would have borrowed from Africa Development Bank, so that the youth can be interested in agriculture. Because the projection is that the next billionaire now, the next mart billionaire is going to be a commercial farmer. And that projection is into 2040, which is just tomorrow. So you will be there, I will be here, and we shall be exchanging notes. Yes. Therefore, the youth, look at the education. When you look at the agenda 2063, and you look at how we intend as African continent to revolutionize the education, have the curriculum, how will the curriculum be? And we are progressively moving there. Look at the curriculum now in Uganda and majority of the African countries. And look at how, because it is progressive assessment, cumulative assessment, that and out of class assessment is taking the biggest chunk. We are not going to be determined, your future is not going to be determined in what you write in 2.5 hours in an examination room. Then we are also looking at taking advantage, because you see, this digital age that we are talking about, the fourth industrial revolution that we are talking about, is not necessarily something that must be a monopoly of those who are peddling capitalism and its evil tentacles. we can take advantage of the same because we are part and parcel of the development of the same technology, and we are not spectators. Our intention, therefore, and the intention of the Agenda 2063, which is being operationalized in some of these things that I'm talking about, the youth are not left out. They are part, they are an engraved part of that whole thing. The women, who are a fulcrum to majority of the African economies, are given a very central role in there. You can see that almost every aspect going forward that will impact the African continent, the people, the segment of the people, including the youth that you are talking about, are at the center stage.
Oh, as we are coming to the tail end in like 5 minutes, I want you to react on the observation that most African leaders are standing up against LGBT and gay rights, and in the form of there is a way it is packaged as human rights. I've seen Emerson Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe, standing up to Richard Quest of CNN. I've also seen Jomo Kenyatta, the former president of Kenya, standing up to Aman Paul on CNN. Also, our Right Honorable Deputy Speaker and those that, when I think some conference, stood up, unanimously and said we cannot sell our values in exchange, for aid, and they stood their ground against LGBT rights and homosexuality. Can we say that is the Pan-African spirit speaking behind all this and trying to protect the African continent from cultural erosion and degeneration? And we've seen, and people even say the highest suicide rates are in most European, American metropoles. What is your reaction to that?
I have said it before, comrade, and I will repeat it here, that Africa, in terms of morals, has got nothing to learn from Western Europe and America, absolutely. And I want to also state that if the Western Europe and America were to be honest, they should come and benchmark us in terms of morals and values. African society is a value-led society. Now, and if you want to see this, you see what we call good manners. If you want to see this, there are some small things, they appear small, and one time, I think it was the recent Olympics, I said, you sit with me here on this screen. I said, no, you see, you look at the African athletes, and you look at these other from other places, and tell me, to the extent that you would look at a Jamaican lady, how they dress, even when it is you're supposed to be, but they will make sure that they cover, vital parts. They are not going to be that. So we have got those values of ours. There is how we dress. There is how we talk. There is how, even if, and our president and our patron of the Pan-African movement, His Excellency Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, was very clear. He said, please, you people, we may not have to lecture you about our values, and we don't need to, but this homosexual business of yours, keep it to yourself. We are not saying don't do it. You go and do it, but don't come and put it on us. I was very happy with the statement that was made by our Deputy Speaker, my good friend, Thomas Tayebwa, Right Honorable Thomas Tayebwa. I could not have said it any better. But remember, it was on the heels of the magnanimous Aunt Rebecca Kadaga, because she was the head of that parliament, and she's the one actually who frustrated all the rubbish that some people wanted to do. Then their own president, the Fountain of Honor, has been at it, and like you correctly mentioned, of course, when you look at Mnangagwa, that one is a product of Robert Mugabe. They may have deferred in their later years, but I can assure you the number of years that they spent together by infection, Robert Mugabe is Mnangagwa. So there is no way the Mnangagwa can now change simply because he wanted to have Zimbabwe recover from what the white man had sent her into. I was in Harare not long ago, where I passed and also went to Lusaka. But I can assure you, when you look at the airport, when you look at the streets of Harare, you can see that there has been a very negative impact. But I want to believe that the people of Zimbabwe, I have my friend Brian Kagoro, who is from there, a very passionate Pan-Africanist. You can see there is a problem, but I want to believe that one time they are going to get out of that situation because they are not seated. So, in a manner of speaking, of course, I have seen our brother, senior comrade Uhuru, also answering questions to CNN, and I wonder why they bring such, with all due respect, these are unkind and irrelevant questions. Why would you ask an African man, well knowing how we hold ourselves in terms of culture about homosexual? Honestly speaking, what are you asking? What do you want? But anyhow, the problem is that we have been economically weak. We have been disunited, and this disunity, the economic weakness, the political disharmony, the overall negative perception in which Africa is held, and every person of the African descent, whoever he or she is, has created an atmosphere of those who claim to be above us to want to put on us things including homosexuality or LGBT, as you are saying, well knowing that we are unable to defend ourselves adequately in terms of standing up to them, because at time T, they assume, and sometimes correctly so, that we shall go to them, upon which they are going to fish out a paper and say, but our request can be met, but first pay attention to what we told you in terms of your policies in as far as the LGTB is concerned. That one is a very unfortunate position, but for us in the Pan-African ranks and the position of the African Union and the majority of the African countries, our position is that we shall keep organizing to resist foreign intrusion in the manner of eroding our culture, because we know that culture is the foundation of all-round development, as has been tested in India, in China, to mention but a few.
Yeah, in just a few seconds, I'd like you to make your parting shot this morning as we wrap up today's topical discussion.
I am very glad that CTV has invited me. This has been has taken long because probably, but there was always time. This has been the time. It's my first time to appear here, being interviewed by my own product. I'm very grateful. I'm also looking forward to a time when we are going to have our fully packed program, the Pan-African debate. I'm also appealing to government, and especially our patron, His Excellency Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, to see the efforts of people like the directors of CTV, and also give them a helping hand. I'm also calling upon the associates in the battle, in the struggle of Pan-Africanism, to rally their efforts and also give all sorts of support, money and otherwise, to have some of these programs have success.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Rugarama. Yes, it has been the conversation here on the Twitter Jab Sunrise at Sea. Heston Munera, we've been discussing Pan-Africanism and African unity, a very brilliant topic that even needs, we could extend to 3 hours or more, but you know, time is always a constraint, especially when you're having these very academic and ideologically oriented discussions. I'm Heston Munera. I'd like to wish you the best of your morning. Please stay tuned for more programming. It has been Sunrise at Sea. Have yourself a wonderful day.